Perfect. Okay, everybody, let's do it. Dope. So I am excited to chat about this whole system of like how we're gonna mess with state from a couple different components and just kind of see how that works in the React context. What we're gonna do is we're gonna build a little application that's gonna essentially just change some colors on our screen. But in order to do that, we're going to build out a couple components and talk about where we might use state to manage some stuff that's going to change, and then build the logical parts of the component out that are the components out that will show us like, how would I go about updating state from a different component or whatnot, right? And when might be circumstances where that's important to do, right? Okay, so first thing I did was I used the create React app command to start a new project, right? So somewhere up here in this mess of terminal output, I ran the npx create React app command just to use create React app to launch this project as a templated project. It installed all the things it needed to install. The thing was stinging, did what it had to do. And now I have this new directory called color container that I can change into and eventually start. One thing I like to do sometimes, like, so you see like, okay, I just used the terminal to launch the project. Couple things that I like to do. I like to use that VS Code shortcut to open my code up. In the terminal, you can chain commands. So sometimes I'll just like put the different commands that I want to do. So put a semicolon after this command. So I'll say code dot, which is going to open this project folder for me. And then the last thing I like to do is npm start. So I just have this, have my code open, my VS Code editor open, and then that terminal should already kind of just start the process of launching the new server, which normally takes a little second, mostly because my computer be running a little slow. So we just got what we got. So while it does that, let's just talk a little bit about the code that came back and what we're going to end up doing in the project. So it's already about to load. Cool. So so create React app default, we got our source directory, which has all of the code that we're going to edit for the React portion. And then everything else kind of is just the default that comes to make the create React app default server launch and run the way that it needs to. So this is still loading, but essentially inside of the source directory, we have our app.js, right? Which is our main component. This is when you use create React app, this is the main component that you have to update to have things render properly on the screen once everything's kind of set up the right way. So in this application, right, all of the visual code that we want to see on the screen has to get rendered from the app, right? But it's not always the case that the code that you're going to write is just going to be in the app. You might not use the app.js for specifically, you might not define all the visual elements specifically in the app.js, like, line by line, each element. You might use a different set of components. You might create your own components and then use the app.js to render those components in a logical way that makes sense for your application. So when you're creating custom components in React, right, we use the source folder and we create a new folder inside of there called components. This is where you want to store all of your new components. And most folks kind of follow this best practice just because it does get to be a point where you have a lot of components in your project. And so with this components folder, right, you can create your custom components that you'll use to then return whatever the visual stuff is that you actually want to see. So I'm going to create just a new component, right? And I'm going to call it color container, which is kind of the name of the app.js. So color container.js is just going to be a container that kind of holds the color that we want it to hold at a certain point. So just going to be a little container that's just going to update color based on some triggers from another component that we'll build in a second. So go ahead, Eric, you got a question?
Quick question. I have seen that some other people also the components doing like a JSX file. There's no difference between doing the components .js and .jsx.
Yeah, so you're talking about instead of this extension being .js, you see some people who do .jsx, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and there's no technical difference in the fact that basically by doing .js, this knows that it's JavaScript and that the file will interpret the JSX syntax as JSX.
Okay.
By saying JSX, you just further specify that it's JSX in React. But no, there shouldn't be a too big of a difference in terms of how the file will work as you're writing them.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
No, great question. Um, cool. So we've talked about a couple different types of components. In the app, we see an example of what's called a functional component. These are components that are meant to be very lightweight. They just kind of return what they need to return for visual purposes. We use JSX, to Eric's point, is basically just all of the visual elements that will kind of show up on our in our eventually in our HTML file. So now that the create React app landing kind of default landing is up, we can see kind of the visual elements here that are being returned from the app.js. We have the div this is a container that's holding a couple other elements. It's holding a header element that has an image, a paragraph, and an anchor. And those are the elements we see. Here's the image, here's the paragraph, and here's the anchor. One thing you might be noticing is with functional components, there's two ways of writing them. You'll see folks write it with the default function keyword, like so, where you do function, name of the component, and you open up and return all of the elements that you want. Sometimes you'll also see people write these components as arrow functions, which would look something like this, or let app or const app or something like this. The whole point, this is also a functional component. This is just written as an arrow function. So it's a little bit, it's just using a new format for writing functions. But the whole, there's no difference between the function component with the function keyword and an arrow component with just the a function component written as an arrow function. Those are basically the same concept. The point of a component, right? Every component's job is to return some JSX. And JSX, again, are these elements that look a little bit like HTML, but at the end of the day, they're translated elements that are now written in JavaScript that allow for you not only to define the visual element that would correspond to the HTML, but you can also pass JavaScript into these different elements as data in different capacities. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second as we kind of keep going on this. But we have our functional component for the app, but I want to kind of show y'all a different type of component that we use, which is a class-based component. And we'll use that format for creating our color container component, which is another custom component we'll create. So creating a class-based component in React is pretty simple. You just import React from the React library. So this is importing a object, a module from this library that we installed. And this React library has an object inside of it called component. And that component is basically a template that we can build any custom class-based component off of. So the syntax then would look like class, whatever the name of the component is going to be. So in this case, it's going to be color container extends react.component. And then we open up some curly braces. And then classes are just have a little bit extra writing you have to do. They have a render function. So the render function is a function that is responsible for, that's what's responsible for returning the JSX for the component. So here's where I would return whatever the JSX is. So now I'll just put some text in the div. This is just a really simple div that just will have some text inside. And I'll just use this as a means of just validating that the component was created the right way. So the last thing you got to remember is when you're writing custom components and creating new files, in JavaScript, it's going to be very important that you export the right objects to then import them in other files. So I want to be able to pass this color container into my app. So I'm going to need to make sure somewhere at the bottom I export the particular component. One other thing you might see, instead of people doing the export at the bottom, just like this, where it's saying, hey, export this default object, which would be this particular object here called color container. Instead of just defining it here where color container is already defined and then you kind of use a separate line, sometimes you'll see people just write the export default in the consideration of the class like this. So the line would just be export default class, blah, 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 extends React component. So this is the same thing, just kind of pointing that out. Yeah, either way, we have this new component, just like the functional component. The job of this component is to return some JSX. The difference is that in a class-based component, there's a couple other functions that get defined to that we can make use of in the process of defining our component. So it separates out some things. Functional components are meant to just be a little bit more lightweight. You just kind of just return what you need to return. Class-based components are helpful for keeping track of things as the component during what we call the life cycle of the component. And we'll talk about that in a second. Cool. So we have this default component. Save this, and I'm gonna save this, and then I am going to make sure that we bring it back into our app. So I'm just gonna delete everything outside of the div that is not really relevant to the app right now. One of the things that is cool about the default Create React app application is that it comes with some styling out of the box for you with the app.css. So these are not the most crazy CSS styles, right? But the header clearly has a background color, has some stuff in there to display all the items in the center. So it kind of looks a little nicer. So I'm just gonna make sure I keep the header because I just want some styling so the app's not as plain. So I'm just gonna delete everything outside of that though. So we have the div, which is just kind of a component that's kind of returning some specific, this is just a class that has some styling from the default Create React app, and then the header. I could very easily just delete this, but I wanna use it for styling purposes so the app looks a little nicer. This simple app that we're gonna build. The thing though is just returning this alone isn't going to show us much, right? There's not going to be anything here but little blank screen, right? So it wasn't like there was any visual elements here that I really wanted to keep. This is more just a stylistic thing that I wanted just to keep that. And actually, now that I think about it, I am actually going to go. I'm gonna go as far as to delete everything else inside of here, and then just to show y'all the point that your app doesn't need to actually have anything. But what I might want to do is return the color container, right? And so I'll just put the color container here. Now that this color container is being returned from the functional component, the app functional component, everything inside a color container is going to get rendered. So that means whatever I define in color container is should show up on our screen. So I go back here, let's just wait. And then there we go. We got our color container. And just some text, some basic text showing up. Cool. Cool. So this is a React component. We have our color container that is showing up here. Clearly, all this component is returning is this div with some text, and the app is responsible for rendering that. And so that's what's rendering this. And now we can just put some more elements inside of our color component. So for instance, if I wanted to update this a little bit more, just put this here. And then instead of just having this div return some text, just to make it a little bit more nuanced, put this point here. I'm gonna just make a heading and just say, let's change the color. And then close this each one. Cool. And we should just see something else. All right, bet. Dope. So We have a new component. We talked about like kind of the more basic parts of React that we already kind of know, the JSX and, you know, the pieces of creating our own custom components, right? And that's really it, right? You can make as many creative custom components as you want and just add them to your components folder and then import them where they belong, and you can render them where they belong to be rendered, right? So cool. Now let's just talk a little bit more about what this app is going to do and how we want to format the app to do what it's supposed to do. So essentially, I just want this app to be pretty simple. I want it to have a background color, right? And either a background color or a box that has some color in it, right? And the whole idea is that we're going to be able to change the color of that particular box just using some other React components. So I imagine that we'll have a an element that will. Now I'm thinking out loud as I'm building. I didn't build this beforehand. I'm literally building it with y'all right now. But I'm thinking we'll have like maybe just a box, you know, and the box will have like some color to it, and then outside of that box we'll have maybe like a couple other like buttons of some kind, and each button will basically update. Each button will update the color of the box. Sounds simple enough, right? Just like we just gotta figure out how we get this box in here, get it colored, and then make a little kind of another set of just some buttons somewhere that we'll use to change some of that up. So as it relates to changing the color or having a box, right? I think maybe just using a div will be pretty simple because divs are containers. We can make that div have a specific set of styling that will give it a height and a width. And that might be a good opportunity to talk about adding styles to our components. And then from there, we can just continue the process of figuring out these buttons, how we're going to change the color, and all of the actual good stuff that we're here to talk about today. So I'm imagining, right, that we'll have some component, right? Just bear with me, y'all. It's going to be some component. We'll call it color box, right? And the color box is just going to show, this is going to show something. It's just going to show the color. That's really all it's going to do. And then I'm imagining that, you know, we're going to want some other kind of component that like, that basically like gives us an opportunity to update the color box, right? So maybe it is a color actions, right? Or something, right? And then basically I see this component just being like a little box of some kind. Like let me annotate this so y'all see what I'm talking about. I'm gotta be visual out here for my folks that need that visual elements. So I'm imagining like we have some box, right? Like that, right? And that box is gonna kind of change colors over time. And then maybe we have like another little box that will have a couple buttons in there, right? And then each button kind of might live like that. I'm sorry that it's getting janky in my design skills, you know what I'm saying? But each button will live in there, and then, you know, subsequently change the color of the box based on whatever you tap. That's basically what I'm thinking about doing. So I'm gonna clear this up and let's just figure out how we'll do this in like kind of a JavaScript React kind of context, right? Knowing what we know. So going back to the color container app that we started. So we have this color container component that's, like I said, basically I imagine we have that box and have the actions. Sometimes it's cool to like mark up, like here's the components I think I might return, right? And then actually go and define them. So now I just want to define the color box and the color actions component. Color box basically is going to be a new component that we're going to create here. And this component doesn't have to be super complicated. So, you know, maybe we don't imagine this being more complicated than just that box that I deleted. But because it's not gonna be too complicated, maybe we could just keep it as a function. So let's just pretend like, hey, you know, let's just keep this as a function for now. So I'm gonna just say const color container, because I'm gonna just write this as an arrow function. And inside of here, we're just gonna return what we wanna see JSX wise. And so I want to see kind of a div, and this div is going to be important to give some attributes to, so that it'll know what it should show, right? So let's do for now, let's just type a specific color. So let's say, I'm gonna say blue, just for the sake of just making sure we see something in there, and that this comes back with some data. So then we're gonna export that color, call this color container, but I meant to call this color box. We're gonna export that box, and cool, we have a nice little simple component, simple enough. So that should show up here now in our color container after I save this. There's probably gonna be an error because it's like, oh, what's color actions? I don't know about that. So let's just make the color actions component as well. Same thing, just make a new component inside of that components folder. Because this component also doesn't really seem like it's gonna be too crazy, or like there's much going on, like we could relatively just say, hey, I just want to return this thing to show up. So maybe keep it as a function, make my life a little easier. So I'm just say const color actions, same thing, create a nice little function here. And then inside of this function, return to JSX. This JSX, I'm definitely going to need a div to just kind of wrap all of those buttons, right? So whenever you think of like some element that's going to be a container of other elements, the best element to use from an HTML standpoint, and thereby in a React standpoint would be like a div to kind of contain all those elements, because then you can style the div. And we'll talk a little bit about that with the color box. But this particular color actions, right? This is just supposed to have a couple buttons, right? So I'm gonna just put this button here, and then let's say this button is, let's change this to, let's just say white, or let's say this button, or let's not do white, because who knows, maybe the background is gonna stay that color, so it might not be easy to see. Black, red, and then let's just do blue. Cool. So I just got 3 buttons. Then I want to export this so I can actually call it inside of the application, inside of the color container. So now that I'm exporting this, inside of the color container, right, color box and color actions, I need to import them, right? So all 3 of these files are inside of the same folder. They're inside of the components folder. So all I have to do is say, hey, import color box from dot. So the dot is going to say, hey, look inside of the folder I'm in, / and then color box. And then I kind of want a similar import for color actions. So I'm going to say import color actions from dot / color actions, right? And that should help kind of get some stuff here on the screen. So we got this little box. It's not a big box, but we got a box, and we have these little buttons that aren't really doing much of anything right now. But cool. So we have like the essence of like what we need. Now, we might be like, okay, like let's style this to make it look a little nicer, so that we kind of see more of what we want to see and make this process a little easier for ourselves. So first thing I want to do is give the color box a little bit more space, so it doesn't just take up just this little bit of space. It just kind of actually takes up a good amount of space, so we can see the color a little bit more clearly. So we're going to go to the color box component, and we're going to talk a little bit about styling. So we actually got a glimpse of how styling works with our app.js originally, right? And some of this boilerplate code is still here, so we kind of can see, how did it work before, right? Well, basically, you can use styles in CSS and pair them with your React components very easily. You just have to make sure that your components have styling to them, and the elements that you're styling inside of the components, you can target those elements with specific class and CSS selectors, right? So in this case, the React is written in JSX. The JSX are JavaScript elements that eventually turn into HTML elements. So your component, right? Your color container or whatnot. If you actually look at the, if you actually inspect the HTML that comes back at the end result, right? You don't see any of that. You don't see color container. You don't see color actions. You don't see anything. You just see, here's a div that is just a straight up div. Then inside we see H1, and the H1 says, let's change the color. Then we see this other div for blue and then another div with our buttons, right? There's not really a lot of segmentation here. But let me add some class name attributes to these various components. And we're gonna see very quickly where the separation is from these component files, right? So here in the, first let's start with the app. So the app.js is responsible for returning our color container. Our color container is a custom component that is rendering just some div, a div in the H1 and then these other technically components here that then turn into clearly just some regular, whatever the elements are that they're responsible for. So point one to make is that at the end of the day, your HTML file is not going to know anything about your component names. You're not going to see those anywhere. What you're going to see are the JSX elements that you made that component up with. So where your component says, hey, color container is going to render a div and H1 and then color box. Well, actually what's going to happen is color box says, hey, I am going to render this div that just says blue. And that's why here we just see the div that says blue, right? Instead of something that says like color container. The way that you can make it easier to see where those lines end and like where each kind of component ends is by using some CSS and like some attributes to make it so that you can make sense of where is each element starting, right? So here we have this div for the color container. I can give this a particular class name, which is an attribute in React that lets me basically give this element a specific unique identifier that I can also use the same identifier elsewhere, but I can use this identifier to also target this div for styling. So we use the class name property, and then you can basically pass in the string that will represent the class name, right? So here, maybe I want to give this one color container. I'm going to say color dash container to kind of keep the syntax the right way, right? And so now if we take a look back at the HTML that comes back, right? Now we see another div that says color container. This color container kind of seems like it's the wrapping our entire application, which is exactly what it's doing, right? The app is only returning this div. But yeah, so now we can style these containers. We can style this container or any of the other elements similarly by putting a class name in there and then passing some styles in there. So one of the ones that I think is the most important, like I was saying, is this color box, which essentially the color box, we want to make this more of like a box. So I'm going to just, let's say I pass a class name into the color box and I'm going to say color box, right? And that is then going to give us on this div for the color box, another attribute that we're going to see. You can see that the class name attribute in React turns into a class attribute in HTML. That's just because in React, we have to use class name because it's JSX, but it's smart enough to say, okay, I'm going to take that and then turn it into a regular HTML class over time. So cool. So now that we have this div with a specific class name, we can actually style it by passing some specific information to that to this component that give it some particular styling. Now, styling in React is interesting, and because you can pass, basically you can pass a CSS file of styles to your components. So sometimes what you'll see is people will make one gigantic CSS file and just pass that over. But sometimes what happens is the naming of those CSS classes might conflict, right? And then cause you some issues with that particular component. So another thing that you'll see, in addition to people creating a source components directory in their source file, you'll see people create some type of a folder for their styles. And inside of here, they'll create specific files that will tie to those particular components. you'll see different variations. Some people will put the styles within the components, some like all types of stuff. But just to kind of keep y'all on track with like some of the things that I've seen and seen as best practices, I'm just going to put some of those styles here. So I'm going to just put colorbox.css. And notice that I named the CSS file the same thing as the component. That way there's just like kind of more congruency there. So here, this is just a normal CSS file. So I just want to make sure I target the right element. So in our color box, I clearly have this class name color-box. So in the color box CSS, I'm just going to close some of these other ones I'm not using. I want to target the color box, right? And basically create a rule. So this is going to say, hey, for any element with the class color box, here's the styling that I'm going to give it. So essentially, I just want this div to be a little bit bigger. So I'm going to just give it a height. Let's just say 300 pixels. And then I'm going to give it a width also of like 300 pixels. And then let's just play around and give it a background color now of blue and just kind of see what pulls up here. Oh, well, nothing pulled up, right? We got our CSS file, but we got to import it into our component. So here at the top, I'm just going to import. So with CSS, the import rule is a little different. You just import the file. So I'm going to say dot basically says look in this current folder, but clearly colorbox.js is in the components folder. And we actually want something in the styles folder, which is up a directory and then inside of a new folder. So we're going to say /styles/colorbox. Cool. And that should be enough to give us some, whoops, what happened here? Oh, my bad. Colorbox.css. And back. So that's enough to help us get the styling across that we really wanted, which is nice bigger block of John. The text is in there still. We don't necessarily need it at this point. And then we got our buttons. So got some cool kind of styling coming back. And if I wanted, I can continue to style all these other elements in a similar fashion. What I will do is get rid of this text because I no longer need it. And we'll kind of have this be as it is. Great. So now we have our first piece. We have the color, we have a box that's going to represent the color, and then we have our buttons. And the thing is, what I want to have happen here, we don't need to see the elements anymore. What I want to have happen here is now, okay, cool. I can click these different elements, and these elements are going to tell the box to change itself, essentially, right? Super simple. Like, hey, I want the color to be black now. I want the color to be red now. I want the color to be blue now. But let's walk through those steps, right? So first step would be, I need to figure out a way to make these buttons trigger actions and like basically let me know what color am I supposed to change, right? That's action one. Action two is I need to let the color box know to change the color to be that specific color. Because right now, the color box is just going to color itself based on whatever, right? And so just to make the case that the color box has its own kind of color set up already, I'm just going to just give this a default kind of just grayish color to start. And then we just want to see that when we tap these buttons, this actually triggers something. So there's a couple different things that we're going to have to keep in mind in making something like this happen. The first thing to keep in mind really kind of comes back to how is this application structured? So let's just take a look at this again. The app.js, our app.js is kind of out of the picture right now. This is returning just our color container. Okay, so color container is responsible for really everything at this point. So I don't really need the app anymore. But looking at the color container, we see that, okay, the color container has a couple things going on in here. It's responsible for rendering both the color box and the color actions. The actions are kind of separate from the color box, right? So in the color actions, I have these buttons, right? I can say, hey, button 1, button 2, button 3. And these buttons might we can trigger some things from these buttons. But eventually, what we're going to want to have happen is the color actions needs to let color box know some stuff about data. Some data needs to change, right? And so I tell y'all this all the time. If we are dealing with components, right, and one component wants to tell another component or talk to another component or send data to another component, what is the React concept that we have to use to pass data from one component to another component?
Props.
Exactly, right? Props are our only way in React to pass data from one component to another. And but the problem is that in this position, in order to use props, right? In order to use props, I have to define the prop in a specific location. So here, like, let's say, for instance, in the app.js, I want to pass a prop to our color container. And I could say, maybe I say like message. So here's me defining a prop called message, right? And I'm gonna say, welcome to the app or something, right? And this message, the reason I'm using message is because inside of the color container, we have this heading. So I'm just gonna change this to just show y'all props real quick, right? So with props, I can pass data to this other component, right? And say, okay, hey, color container, you're gonna get a prop called message, and we're gonna use that. We're gonna use that data in rendering, right? So here in the class, instead of returning this string here, I could return this.props.message because this is a class-based component. So since it's a class-based component, I have to use this dot in front of props for it to show up the right way. But if this was a functional component, it would just be props.message, right? But same kind of concept. Me doing that, right, allows for this application to change based on the data that I passed in from the app, right? So this is just another look at how props work. Props, I can say, hey, the app is going to pass some data to the color container. So this is the place to do it, is passing the prop of the data. So wherever you want to make wherever you want components to have data to use, and you want to pass data from one component to the next, the only way to do that is really using props. So technically, we want color actions, which is one component, to do something on its own that then is going to communicate to this other component, color box, right? And so we know, okay, the only way for us to do that is to use props. But props can only be sent from a parent component, right? So the only component that's actually able to pass props to color box or to color actions is our color container, right? This is our parent component. Because basically, the only place where I can say props are going to be something is here, where I can say prop 1 is going to be equal to blah, 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 blah. Or, prop 2 is going to be equal to blah, 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 blah. Like, I only have the opportunity to pass props from a component that is a parent or a higher up component to whatever component you're rendering. So technically, it's impossible for two components to connect unless they have a component that is their parent, which is why it's very common that you're going to see container components, or you're going to create components that are going to be container components that their responsibility is to just house two components in one place, and you're going to want to pass data between those other two components, right? In this case, we have the color actions, and we want the color actions to talk to the color box. So in order to have this kind of flow work with something like props, we're going to need some wrapping component, right? That is going to house those two components in one place so that we can establish that communication. This is a very common design practice in React, where you're going to want to interact between multiple components. The thing that you need to know is, in order to do this, in order to have this whole flow work out, we're going to need not only to just use props to pass the data, we're going to need state as well to make sure we hold the data that needs to change and we can pass it to each component as props. So we're going to see this all in a second. Let's keep building the app and get this going. So first thing I want to do next is just make these buttons work, right? So buttons are event handling elements. So each out button can tie to a specific function, right? And the function that the buttons use as an event handler for the most part is onClick. So onClick is a specific attribute that each button, most HTML attributes or most HTML elements, and thereby most React JSX elements, are going to be able to respond to certain types of events on user triggered events. OnClick is one of the most common ones, right? Click, if I wanted to click anywhere on this web page, I could tie an OnClick handler to this part of the page. If I wanted to figure out when the user clicked this text, I could put an OnClick event handler on this heading, right? Similarly for these buttons, if I want to know when these buttons are clicked, I can add the onClick event attribute. So basically with attributes like this, you basically say, okay, whenever this button gets clicked, I'm going to tell it what function should it call to basically update itself, right? So essentially, right, for instance, I can define other functions that can be used for this button to kind of trigger itself, right? So for right now, I'm just going to put a specific handle click function. I'm going to just make a little arrow function. And I'm pretty sure I need to just put a variable for this. So handle click is just going to be a function that we're going to just pass here. This function, all it's going to do is console log. Actually, let me use an alert so I don't got to pull up the console. We'll just alert click, right? And so now I have this handle click function that's defined here. And basically now I'm going to just pass handle click as a trigger for whenever this button gets clicked. So when this black button gets clicked, I will expect to see an alert that pops up that shows, okay, hey, you clicked it, right? So cool. So now we know that that button is wired up enough to have some actions kind of trigger here. So, you know, I might want similarly for all these buttons to have a similar kind of setup, right? Where each button has some type of a event handler. For now, let's just put the same onClick in there for handle click, which we defined up there. That way now, if you click on any of the buttons, we got a little kind of setup coming back where each of these are getting clicked. Cool. So what really do we want to have happen here, right? Well, technically what I want to have happen here is I want the black to let the thing know, hey, change to black, right? I want you to change to be this particular color that I just clicked, right? So that's all cool, but you know, kind of hard to say how we're gonna do that, right? Like, how are we gonna let this button know? How are we gonna let the other element know? Hey, you know, like we got color actions are doing stuff, but once color actions do the stuff it needs to do, we need to figure out some way to alert almost the other component to, hey, update yourself to this particular thing, right? That's exactly what I'm saying is going to happen often when you're building out applications with multiple components that need to communicate to each other, right? Because we need to pass some information from color actions into our color box, we need to figure out a way to go from talking here, so hey, something happened inside of color actions, to hey, color box, it's time now for you to update, right? And again, the only way we can do this is by props. So technically we need some way for color box to get triggered in a way that's going to update its styling, so that we know, okay, hey, you know, color box is going to get whatever it needs and tell us what the style should be, right? So let's figure out how we're going to make this kind of design framework work for these particular components here. And how we will end up using the state to make that possible. So why state, right? Well, remember, we talked about state for these last couple of sessions. State is data that can change. Props is data that cannot change. Once I give a component its props, that data cannot change, right? So for instance, essentially what we're going to really want to do is we want the color box to not just kind of have this default color that's coming back in the style, right? We want it to be a little bit more nuanced, right? So instead of just like having like, okay, hey, it's just a color box, we want the styles to basically change. And one of the cool things about React is that we can make this whole process of what we call conditional rendering or conditional styling possible, just using the JavaScript that we have available to us in React. So essentially, what we would rather have is like somehow for color box to know, hey, what color box should I be? Should I be a white box? Should I be a black box? Should I be a blue box? What kind of box should I be, right? And essentially, we talked about how we can use the styles from the color box CSS that I don't have open anymore, right? We can use styles to change those things, right? So essentially, like maybe what we really want to have happen here is this background color to go from gray to blue to black, to red, based on whatever button somebody is clicking. And we want that to do that pretty consistently. So that's essentially what we want to achieve here, is have this color box update its styling based on the buttons that are triggered. So clearly we want data that's going to change, right? This data is going to change. Like we want red to blue to black, and we need that data to be updatable, right? So essentially what we might want to figure out is how can we update some data somewhere that will then be able to tell the color box, hey, update this to this, update this to this, right? That's where this whole idea of state in this container-like model is going to be really come in handy. So let's just talk about how we will do this. So essentially what I'm imagining is color actions are going to trigger, right? Like they are right now. They're going to fire off and let us know something needs to update. And here's what's the interesting thing. What we want to have happen almost as an intermediate step. Once color actions updates and something changes, I want to let the parent component know, hey, update to something, and then pass some data to color box that it should use while it's rendering, right? So essentially, I want this color container to be notified whenever color actions is suggesting that something should change. Color actions, the button will fire, and somehow I want to let the color container know, hey, the data should change, right? So it would almost be cool if there was like some way for us to, create a callback, like where, hey, if this button gets triggered in color actions, right, whenever the button gets clicked, somehow we can let this parent component know. And that's actually very possible to do with React by using props. And we can use props in a very unique way that might be a little unorthodox when you first see it, but at the same time, it's going to do exactly what we're talking about, create a callback function for us to call whenever something's happening in a child component. So basically, here's how we're going to do this. The color actions, we already have it kind of hitting some kind of function whenever the button gets clicked, right? This handle click function is being called. What we want to do is let the color container know, hey, color actions is notifying us of some kind, right? So I'm going to just define a new function, and I'm going to call it color should change, right? And this is going to be an arrow function, just going to make a new arrow function here. And one of the things you got to note that's different between class-based components and functional components is when you make a new function in a class-based component, you don't put like a variable kind of key like let or const or anything. It'll give you an error because in a class, you don't need those variable declaration keywords. You just need to make the name of the function. So here I'm just naming the function color should change, right? In this function, should get notified by color actions, right? So this function is just supposed to be a callback function, right? So here's how simple this is to do in React, component to component, to create like a callback like structure where one parent component will get notified whenever a child component is in need of notifying it. So all you have to do to create a structure like this is pass this component down to your other component, your child component, as a prop. So here I'm going to say on color click. So I'm just naming a prop, right? Remember, this is a prop, so I can name this whatever I want. So I'm gonna just call it on color clicked. I'm opening up the curly braces because I want to pass a JavaScript object here. And I'm going to pass the reference to this particular function. So here, basically the function is called color should change, right? But in classes, because this is a class-based component, I have to preface it with this keyword as well. If you I just typed color should change, and VS Code helped do this for me just to remind me. But technically, and because this is a class-based component, I have to put this dot in front of the name of the function. Just like in the class-based component, I ought to do this dot props or this dot state, which we'll see in a second. I'm just basically passing the function that I defined up here, right? So I'm just gonna to just prove this point. I'm just gonna alert here, color container notified. Cool. So color actions now has a prop called on color clicked. On color clicked is receiving a reference to this specific function that I just defined in the color container, right? So inside of color actions now, where we're calling handle click, instead of just running this alert here, I'm gonna call, so because this is a functional component, right? Class-based components are cool because you don't need to do any kind of extra stuff to start using props and stuff like that. Props kind of come out of the box. But with functional components, you got to add props inside of the function parentheses. So saying props here, and then essentially, instead of calling that alert, I'm going to call props dot on color clicked. Right? That was the name of the function, I think. Yeah, on color clicked. So props dot on color clicked is referring to this function that I called, that I created here, right? But the only thing is, instead of just like calling the reference, I actually want to run that function. So I'm gonna put the parentheses there to say, hey, run this function, props dot on color clicked. So let's see what happens now in our application now that we have the on color click prop going down. So when I click black, cool. Now we're getting color container notified, right? Instead of it saying clicked. So now whenever these buttons are being clicked, hey, color container notified. Well, great. That solves one of my problems. Well, now if the color container is going to get notified, right? Now I might be able to use the color container to specifically tell the color box, hey, here's the color you need, right? Here's the color you should change to, right? I could also use a very specific attribute from in HTML for buttons, right? To make this a little bit more possible as well. So let's just take a look at the button reference in HTML for how buttons work, right? So buttons are elements that you can click, right? And they have a bunch of attributes that you can define. One of them that is helpful if you're using buttons, or if you're using form-like elements like inputs and stuff, is the value attribute. And the value attribute basically lets you specify an initial value for the button. So that means that inside of this button for our color actions, right? And not only can I pass not only can I just do something when it clicks, I can say, hey, I can give each button a value. I can say, hey, this value is going to be this string black, or like this button's value is going to be, let me close this so it's easier to see. This button's value is going to be red. And then this button's value is going to be blue, right? So I'm just using another attribute here called value, and we'll see why this is going to be helpful here in a second. So whenever an event is triggered on an object in JavaScript, right, you get access to a specific object called an event object. You just need to make sure that whatever function you're calling makes use of that event object. So here, to make use of it, you just gotta call it as data for your function to make a reference to. Some people call this event spelled out just like this. Some people call it E, but I like to call it event just so that it's clear what's going on there. So what I'm gonna do is console.log the event.target so that we can see whenever one of these buttons gets clicked, we can see which button got clicked. The event.target will always show you what element triggered this particular event handling function. So I'm going to go back to the app and inspect the console just so we can take a look at what's going on in there as things go. Oops, what is this? Color box is not defined. I don't know what this is. I'm gonna mess with this. Oh, maybe this is just old warnings or something. Yeah, that's OD. That almost gave me a live coding heart attack. Anyway, now that I click this black button, right? So clearly I'm getting back the event.target, which shows me that this particular button was the one that got triggered. If I one of the unique things about event targets is that you can, so if I take a look at just the entire event, we'll see this. So let me just, in this event now, right, I'm gonna click red this time, just be different. So here's the actual event object, right? And if you scroll down, you can see the target. And the target shows us the button that got tapped. So when we do event.target, of course, it's gonna give us back this button. But the target has some other properties in there that we can make use of. Some of them are defined here. So clearly, value is a particular sub element that we can target from the target. So we can do the event.target.value to get back the value that was set to, which is cool. This is really helpful for, like I said, for buttons, for form inputs. So if you have a form input that has a specific updating value, you could use event.target.value to get back that value. It just helps you to specify which what is going on there. So anyway, now that I have event coming back, I could do event.target.value. And you might be wondering, like, what are these little kind of space things that kind of just popped up? I have a linter on my VS Code that kind of just tries to clean up some of these some of my elements over time when I save the file. These are just adding some spaces around the button, just to give it a little bit of space. So it's not adding anything extra here. You don't got to worry too much about it. But anyway, what we are going to worry about is this event.target value situation here. And if I go back to the app and click blue this time, just to mix it up, right? So clearly I'm getting blue back. So event.target.value is passing back that same value that I set to the button. So not only are we knowing when this function gets clicked, what button clicked it, we also can get some data back from that button that then we can, if you're thinking along the lines of what you're seeing here, yeah, we're gonna pass this as data to our callback function that we call from the parent component. So again, let's just run through this one time. So the color container, we have this function that we defined inside of it called color should change. And this is just going to notify us whenever color action says, hey, this color should change. We pass that down to that color actions as a prop, right? So whenever color action says props.onColor clicked, it's referring to this particular function, right? That function, so when we call props on color click, we're now gonna pass back the event.target value from each button that was clicked. So now the props function, right? So remember, props is here. This is this function. So this function now is gonna get back some data. I guess we could call it It's getting back data that is coming from the color actions. We could call it a color, I guess, but essentially what it's going to be getting is whatever this is passing here. So clearly on color clicked is passing event.target.value. We know that what that's passing is the value. So maybe I could say something like color value or something, right? And so now here, I can say in this alert still, I'll say color container notified, color box should be, and then I'm gonna just put this, color box should be, and then just put another string, color value. So this is basically saying, hey, take this string and then put the color value. Another way I could write this in JavaScript to make a use of the JavaScript inside of the string would be to just use a templated string like this, where you use backticks instead of the quotes, and you just put the JavaScript values as with this syntax of like $, curly brace. So this would say, hey, color container notify, color box should be this particular color, well, this particular value. So this is just going to just confirm for us that we got the right data being passed back. Color value. Oh, I got to save this. Cool. So now color container notified, color box should be blue. Or if we do red, color container notified, color box should be red. Okay, cool. So we're literally right around the corner from finishing this up. The most important thing that we're seeing here is how can we not only pass data from one component to the next? We know that we use props to do that, right? So color actions, in order to pass data back to the color container, we use the prop. But the valuable thing is we passed a function as a prop. So that function is going to get called by the child component, right? Just like we pass props and we use props like a regular data, we can also use a function as props. And that function will call the parent function whenever it needs. And then you have this function defined inside of your parent. So now you can use that return value from your parent component. It's a pretty sophisticated design pattern that we see often in React, which is passing data around with props. Now let's just talk about what happens next, right? Because we want to change this color before we wrap for the day, right? So clearly now this component is returning our is getting the color value back, right? So clearly color value in this point in time is a data piece. We saw it come back in the alert. Maybe if if this alert is looking a little crazy, clearly this console log will show you just the color values coming back. So I'm gonna just put color box should be, and then color value. So the next step here, right? So now that we have this prop function that's gonna just get triggered, this function is gonna get triggered by the child component. And when it gets triggered, it's going to pass back event.target.value. We're going to note that here and say, okay, cool, I'm getting back the value there. So now whenever this function gets called, I'm getting notified and I should just be able to do whatever I want to do. Well, what really do I want to do? Well, I want to be able to tell Colorbox, hey, you should change your color to be something else, right? Instead of being whatever you are now, you should be whatever I just tell you, whatever this color value is. So you might be thinking, okay, let's pass that as props, right? Like, because that's how we connect one component to another. That's exactly right, right? So we might want to say, okay, I might give the color box a prop and call it color value, right? And color value is essentially, or maybe I say color, right? And color should be getting whatever the I'm sorry. I was looking at color for so long. I'm like, this word looks so weird. Like, did I spell color wrong this entire lesson, or like, am I bugging? Like, but anyway, I'm like, anyway. So now that we have this prop here, we can pass the data that we want. So technically, the data that I would want to pass is color value, right? But color value is kind of living in this function as just a value in this function. If I try to get color value here, right, I'm actually going to run into an error because color value actually isn't even defined at that point, right? Color value only is defined in the scope of this function. Outside of this function, nothing in this other component knows about color value. So I want this component to know about some data that clearly is going to change, right? What kind of React data can I use to keep track of a data piece that's going to change inside of a component? Well, that's state, right? Anytime you're dealing with data inside of a component that's going to change and you want that component to be able to see the data, update the data, right? You're going to want to use state. So this is literally the last step here that we want to do is we want to make sure that our color container has some state associated with the particular color that we want to see, right? So I forgot there's an error here. I don't know why I tried to refresh, but basically we want to add a state value to our class. So remember with class-based components, the way you add a state object, you create a constructor. Constructors, just like the render function, are a built-in function into components. Just some good habits for writing your constructors is to declare props in there, and then super init your props. You might notice like, hey, this kind of looks like how the function components look, right? And like they took practices from the class-based components to make functional components. So initializing with props here, stuff like that are things that you might see similar to how functional components are written, but came from how class-based components have to be structured. But anyway, if I want to create state in a class-based component, all I got to do is inside of the constructor, create a new state object. So I say this dot state, and I'll open up a set of curly braces, and I can create the value that I want here. So I might just say color here is, let's just say pink or something that we don't know yet, right? And essentially, right, when color should change gets triggered, right? Instead of just console logging what the color value is, I want to set the state to say, hey, change this color to the color value, right? So take color value and save it in the state as color, right? And that way, now, instead of having to pass color box just something that didn't exist, I can tell color box that it's going to get this dot state dot color. Right? This dot state is referring to the state object we created, as well as the state object that we updated here. So whenever the color should change, gets updated, so will the color. Now, what's interesting here is we're passing the state as a prop to the color box. This is a really interesting thing because, y'all are seeing a lot of interesting things happen in this one little app, right? Not only do we do the props callback function system, where it's also looking at this idea of state being passed as a prop. So you can always pass state, but what's unique about passing state as a prop is that, of course, color box won't be able to update the color, right? But what's interesting here is that because this dot state dot color is mutable, right? This might go from pink to blue to whatever. Because this dot state is going to change, that means that this component's prop will change, and this prop will change to say whatever the state value is over time, which is going to help us in this process of allowing color box to more flexibly respond to all of the color actions that are being kind of passed here. So let's just kind of take a look at where we are right now. Hopefully the app will stop crashing and run the right way. Okay, so all we're at right now, we have our action buttons. We have our callback function that gets triggered whenever we click one of these buttons. That callback function inside of color actions, we can see this dot, we can see event.target.value is black, but that function, when we click this button, right, that button triggers us to call that callback, that props function that we defined. And when that props function gets defined, clearly we're console logging the color box should be and setting the state. So here we say color box should be black, right? So now we're imagining that the state should show that this.state.color should be the same as black at that point, right? So the best way to test this is now that we're passing color into the color box, right? We can go back to the color box, and just as before, we can pull in props, and let's just console.log color box received props, and we're going to say props.color, right? Which is the name of the color. So here, right, we see color box received props black. If I click red, color box should be red in the color container, and color box received props red, right? If I click blue, clearly that callback function is working, and now color box received props blue. So the color box is receiving updated props every time the state changes, which is important to know, right? That by giving another component props that are tied to a state value, like we're doing in the color container here. So because the color box's data for color is tied to this.state, that means whenever the state updates, so will the color box's color prop. And because the state is updating and this prop is updating, our application is going to be able to re-render, and we're going to see some changes. So the last thing we want to do, finally, to see this app work the right way, we know that our color box is going to receive some color from props. So instead of defining the styles just here, I can tell the styles to change based on the props that it receives. So there's a couple different ways you can style components. We'll definitely talk more about this over time. But right now, I showed you kind of the class name way, where you can style a component based on a particular class name. Another way that you can style a component is by passing an object for your styles in as props, like as not a prop, it's an attribute to your component. So basically, here we have color box that's defined in the color box.css, right? Height, width, and background color. I'm just going to create a couple other classes in here that are going to be called, let's just say white, and we're going to say background color. Or no, what are the colors we have? We got red. I'm going to just make this gray for now. We have red, right? We have black. And we have blue. So just do the same thing, right? And I'm gonna just do pink just so that the app doesn't crash when it first tries to do this. So I'll just define a couple other CSS classes, right? So here's what we're gonna do. In the color box, we now know that it's gonna receive some props that has a specific color. One of the ways that I can change the style is just add to this class name some JavaScript to say, hey, take this color and like make that the class name, right? So basically what that would look like is instead of just color box being kind of just this blank string like this, I'm gonna make it a JavaScript. I'm gonna use the JavaScript to edit this a little bit more creatively. So here I'm gonna say, color box, right, which was the original name of that class name. But remember, like I said, with backticks, you can really easily add other JavaScript variables into your strings. So here I'm just going to say props.color. And what this should do essentially is not only give this, it'll give this two class names, one class name called color box and one class name with the props.color. So pink, blue, whatever the props.color is, which is why I made these other class names that should change based on what props.color is. So let's see if this works. Okay, so we see this is blue. We see now it's black. See it's red. See it's blue again. Black, red, blue. Black, red, blue. So now our app is doing all of the things that we hope it would have done when we first got started, right? To just do a quick little review, We made a color container. This was the entire container for this entire little application. Color container is a pretty sophisticated component now. It has a couple responsibilities. The main responsibility of the color container is to return the JSX that we want to see, right? So we have our div with the heading, we have the color box, color actions, right? And what's unique about this is color actions and color box are two separate components with different responsibilities. Color actions is a user input type thing, is processing user input. Color box is just visualizing some data. It's just going to sit there and change. But what we wanted to do was create a system where the user generated actions triggered some of this like more static content that's sitting there. And we can use React to do that very easily. But in order to pass the right amount, to pass the data the right way, we need to use props. So color box and color actions have to use props in unique ways to make this all possible. For starters, color actions is needing, in order to have one component talk to another component that is like basically they're not parents of each other, they're sibling components, right? I need to talk to them through a parent. So my little brother cannot talk to me. My little brother got to talk to my mama gonna talk to me. and the little brother component, right, is like, okay, cool. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're both brothers, we're both siblings, but in order for us to communicate to each other, we need the parent component, which is why you'll have these container-like components that wrap both of them. The color box component is really responsible for just showing the box, right? It's just showing the box, but it is gonna receive some data as props to change how the box is gonna show up, right? The color actions just is some buttons, but it is going to pass, it's gonna use props to alert our parent component, hey, something changed here. And that update is really the root of us saying, okay, hey, change the state. The state is being maintained by the parent, right? And now the parent is letting the sibling child know, right? Okay, hey, here's the state. We pass the state as a prop, which allows for this prop to change over time and be mutable, right? Because we can't change the prop ourselves, but if we pass state as a prop, this parent can change the state, which will change this prop over time as well. And that's how our app works, right? We pass all of these different things and that gets us there. I will put this code up on GitHub so y'all can take a look at it and feel free to poke around through it to just get a better sense of how it works. But yeah, these are very common React design patterns, using state and using props. Passing callback functions as props, using as parent state, like maintaining state in one component and updating it from a different component in order to pass the state to another component, right? All of these things, like I said, kind of get at the most core parts of how React works with state and props. And again, you know, gets a little kind of confusing, I'm sure. But these three ideas of components, state, and props, these are the only three things you have to really learn to get good at React. And over time, learning these types of design patterns will make a lot more sense in practical context. But I thank y'all for taking the time to stick with me and take a look at it. And yeah, we'll look at this again next time.